Some of you know my friend, Megan Lyons, who's minister of the Harvard Unitarian Universalist congregation, where about 85 of us celebrated Passover together on Friday night. So Megan told me recently she's always been a little obsessed with trying to hatch eggs. Not metaphorically, though maybe that too, but literally. And she told me when she was in 9th grade, she decided that she was going to try to hatch chicken eggs. No mama chicken, no incubator involved. I don't even know if these were fertilized eggs or she just pulled them out of the carton. She said she was just determined and she had a lot of fleece. So apparently she tucked a bunch of eggs into that pocket of her sweatshirt and carried them around school with her for days. She had someone babysit them for her during gym class, but otherwise they were hers. Not surprisingly, they didn't hatch. She also told me she got in trouble because she dropped more than one of them while running down the hall, and her teachers thought she was throwing eggs at school. So it was not an ideal situation. So she gave up trying to hatch eggs for several decades, but now she and her son, Jesse, who is 6, have backyard chickens, and they are both passionate and devoted chicken keepers. And last year, she and Jesse actually hatched 4 chicks together. Fertilized eggs this time with the right incubator. And she told me that once the hatching had started, Jesse sat beside the incubator for hours, his eyes wide, holding his breath, watching this miracle unfold. And when the first chick finally broke free of its shell, she asked him, "What do you think?" And he answered, "Mama, it's so hard for them to get out." And I keep thinking about that story, about 5-year-old Jesse waiting and watching as the chicks struggled their way into being. Such an act of hope for both the chicks and the little boy who already understood that new life is so often very hard. It so often takes a long time, and it is miraculous when it comes. The story of the first Easter begins as a really hard story. New life and hope are nowhere to be found. As you heard, it starts with the women who love Jesus the most, going in the early morning in their new and terrible grief to get his body ready for burial, this very last loving thing they can do. And when they arrive at the place his body has been laid, he isn't there. I want you to imagine the awfulness of that moment, the fear and confusion layered onto their deep grief. Where is he? What have they done with him? And who could they ask for help? Because Jesus had just been executed for insurrection, and his followers were considered dangerous insurrectionists too. The author of the Gospel of Mark doesn't write this explicitly, but the audience would have known that the women who went to tend to Jesus' body were putting themselves in serious danger. The Roman authorities and the Jewish religious leaders considered Jesus a criminal, not because he had committed crimes, but because he was making trouble, and they were glad to have him gone. The Jewish religious leaders were trying to maintain this extremely delicate balance of power with the Roman occupiers. And Jesus, with his public declarations of corruption and turning over tables in the temple, he was making things hard. And they were afraid, and realistically so, that if Jesus started an uprising among the Jewish people, the Romans would respond with brutal force. And the Jews would lose both their fragile control on the temple and their nationhood. So the disciples were all in hiding that first Easter morning, no doubt grieving, devastated by the murder of their beloved friend. But they were also laying low, just in case more arrests and crucifixions might be in anyone's mind. But the women came to the tomb anyway. They brought the oil and spices for anointing. They brought the linens to make a shroud. And instead of the body of their friend, they found the stone rolled away and strange and terrifying messengers telling them he is not here. He has risen. And as you heard, the original Gospel of Mark ends with the women running away and saying nothing because they were afraid, which is the ending that actually makes the most sense to me. In the other three Gospels written after Mark, Jesus appears to the disciples again after his death. In one way or another, he walks with them, he eats with them, he gives them final operating instructions before ascending into heaven. The Gospel of Mark actually got a second ending 75 years later, after it was written, in which Jesus appears again to Mary and the disciples. And the early church leaders did this because they thought the original ending was too unsettling. They thought that fear and silence and an unclear cliffhanger mystery ending aren't things you can build a church around. So they added definitive proof of the resurrection to this version of the story too. But I prefer the cliffhanger mystery. Because, of course, we don't know. We don't know whether Jesus appeared to his beloveds in some way after he died, or they just imagined that he did, that they felt him with them. Did he really walk with them and eat breakfast with them and speak to them, or did they simply sense his nearness? Did they hear his familiar voice in their own hearts? Death is a mystery, and I have felt the near presence of those who have died too many times to dismiss it as nonsense, the way the disciples do in the Luke version of the story. And I know that many of you have too. And we know that love does not disappear. But whatever happened that first Easter, the resurrection that we need is not the literal or physical or bodily resurrection of Jesus. It is not his defiance of death that we need. The resurrection we need is the resurrection of all that made Jesus human. We need the resurrection of his humanity, of all that he preached and taught, not just with his words, but with his entire life. We need a resurrection of the very things that Jesus was put to death for. His radical inclusive love, his willingness to welcome, to truly love those of his day who were outcast and marginalized. We need a resurrection of his wild, beautiful hopes for humankind. his belief that if we all shared what we had, there'd be enough, his insistence that we take care of one another, that we tend to the sick and feed the hungry and visit those who are imprisoned. We need a resurrection of his vision, what Dr. Martin Luther King called the beloved community, where all people belong, and no one is outside the circle of worthiness, and no human life is disposable. That is the resurrection we need, and that is the resurrection I believe in. And I hope you will choose to believe in it too. Resurrection as the force of love. Love that brings us back from the fear and the hatred our country is mired in. Resurrection as the strength of love, which calls us to resist all that dehumanizes. Resurrection as the power of love to call us back from despair, to bring us back to life, even when we don't think it's possible. Resurrection as a love which gives people hope and the courage to act on that hope. Resurrection as the stubborn insistence that love is the strongest power. Jesus was put to death for threatening a system built on oppression, cruelty, and fear. He was killed by the empire to silence a rising movement. Those who use their power to oppress others are always afraid of the dissidents and the resistors. Those who lead by fear and brutality are always afraid of people who give others hope and who hold out a vision for what this world could be if love were at the center of it. And that is exactly what Jesus did. I don't need to tell you all of the ways that this is not just a story. Easter says no to empire. Easter says no to despair and no to the lie that death and power get the last word. Easter tells us life is already rising to meet us. And so we must rise to meet it. And how we rise. We have all seen it. We have seen how people rise from grief and find their way back. We have seen how our children who struggle and stumble find their footing and thrive. We have seen how people recover and heal even when a cure is not possible. And we have seen how we can love and love and love. Dr. Kendall Gibbons writes, life rises. Not because death isn't real. Crucifixion is not just pretend, but something else is even more real. Community rises, outrage rises, love rises, faith rises, hope rises again and again. That is all faith means. That is all faith has ever meant.